this is the second half of chapter 6 of Yahweh Exists, volume 1. So what we're looking at is ancient Israel's allegation. They had claimed that the way of Yahuwah was unfair, that his law was too difficult to obey, and that really his law was virtually useless. It was not something that benefited for them. It was unequal and unfair, and really was a way that was counterproductive to life and living. So what I have done in this book is put God on trial, put his law on trial, and see if these allegations are true and correct, or see if maybe there's actually validity to them. And what we've discovered along the way is actually quite fascinating. So we are on page 204, and we begin this week by looking at family function. We get into the relationships that God tells us are healthy and those that are unhealthy. So the thought here is that if God created humanity, that he actually knows something about how our bodies work, how our psychology works, and he understands a little bit about the types of relationships that are healthy for us and those that are unhealthy for us. So one of the relationships that he tells us is unhealthy, both psychologically, emotionally, as well as physically. And here I'm speaking specifically to disease, is that of incest. He tells us that we should not have sexual relationships with our aunts, our uncles, our own children, our own grandchildren, and really just puts in stone and codifies moral relationships. He also states that it's immoral for a son to marry his father's former wife, even if she's not his biological mother. Now remember, this was the case in point in Genesis, where Reuben slept with his father's, Jacob's wife, even though she was not his biological mother. And this caused Jacob to totally disinherit Reuben as the firstborn. He still received a landed heritage, but he did not receive the birthright or the blessing because he forfeited it due to his unrighteous acts in that relationship. So we find that God takes this very seriously, and ancient societies, especially ancient Israel, also took it very seriously. We also find that the overall ideology governing this precept is that it is the protection of the family unit. God puts everything in place. It's as though, we call Torah the law of Moses. We call it the covenant of Israel, the foundation of Israel. But even more than that, we could honestly call this a family code or family protection, because every single statute, every single judgment that is given to us is ultimately to protect that individual family unit and further protect the clan within the nation. And by focusing on the individual family unit, it strengthens the entire nation and makes them strong in every way. So the other injunction that we're given is that a person should not have relationships with stepchildren brought into the marriage. If a family unit dissolves either due to divorce or say a spouse dies and there is a remarriage, any children that come into that marriage, whether it be a stepson or stepdaughter, are treated as though they are biological children. There really is there's no distinction made in those positions, because God views those as family positions. Whether they are filled by biological or stepchildren is really irrelevant. The position still remains. So God is trying to protect the integrity of that relationship and the health of the overall family unit. We also find that these injunctions are very much tied to protecting the family and, again, the larger society from disease. One of the things that we learn, and you can look at this, it's called the Mendelssohn Inheritance for Disease. There's an entire website based on Mendelssohn's research, and that is when you marry close relations, or say there's an affair between close relations, the dominant genes are much more likely to inherit those diseases than are the children. Rather, the children of those affairs are more likely to inherit disease rather than a larger population where that risk and the DNA is watered down, so to speak, among other characteristics of other people. Now, Susan asks a great question. She says, who did Adam and Eve's children procreate with? I have seen two theories. One is that they did indeed procreate with their siblings. The other is that there were actually other people still living on the earth at this time, you know, whether we say they're the Homo sapiens versus the humanoids or something like that. We don't know. We are given several accounts of creation within Genesis. So it is possible, not outside the range of possibilities, that other people lived. But let's say, for instance, let's go with the traditional view that Adam and Eve's children procreated with each other. What risk did this have? And was it something that was prohibited at that particular time? If you look at DNA and you study some of the early texts that we have from Assyria, one of the things that you find is that DNA was more concentrated because it had not been dispersed among the nations. If we follow Genesis 12, you have all family characteristics, whether it was Ethiopian or Nubian characteristics, whether it's Japanese, Chinese, Western European, all of those characteristics were concentrated in one gene pool. That's right. And you know, they hadn't lived a long period of time to corrupt their lives, to corrupt what they did for disease to enter in. So the risk was not as great, and it may not even have existed at all at creation or even 1,000 years after creation. It is, and I am theorizing here, that over the generations of continually doing these immoral acts, of participating in these ways that are not good and ways that we should not live by, but continuing to do this generation after generation, it introduced disease into the family tree, and then it became inherited. And then as the families separated, once the languages were divided in Genesis 12, then you have specific traits and specific diseases that become localized within that population and that community. You find, for instance, there are some Amish communities today that have very distinctive diseases because they intermarry within a very closed social class. So some of their children are born with 6 fingers, and they have some heart problems and some different maladies for one reason. It's a closed gene pool, and you're not really, and if there is a violation of Torah in any way, and it's not, for lack of a better term, watered down with other genetics, then it becomes dominant rather than recessive. So I don't know that at the time of Adam and Eve, when their children married, if it would have been considered a sin at that point in time. I think it probably took maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years for those relationships to become a problem where it was a threat to society, and it was a threat as far as disease and as far as disabilities that children would be born with. So I do see that as something that was progressive within the law and wasn't necessarily a statute at the very beginning. So continuing on, and I'm on page 205 if you want to follow along, you know, we find that Yahweh's morality code really helps to curb diseases. At least it curbs the passing down of those diseases from one generation to another. Doesn't totally eliminate it, but it does decrease the risk. The other thing that Torah prohibits, as not only close family relationships, there are certain types of social relationships that are also prohibited. One of the foremost of these is homosexuality. Now, the current debate today, and it's a very unpopular one. I would say that the biblical paradigm is definitely fallen out of correctness and is very much demonized today, and that is the fact that there is an open ban on homosexuality in Torah. In fact, YHWH tells us that the consequence of a nation allowing and embracing homosexuality is that that nation will be driven off of their land. That is the cause and effect. So my next question, because again, we are investigating the validity of the law. Are these just arbitrary things that God came up with to make our lives hard and to make life unfair? Or is there something that is inherently good about these statutes and judgments? What we find with homosexuality is that most of our sexually transmitted diseases actually arise within the homosexual community, and then they are passed because homosexuals are not they're usually bisexuals. In other words, they will have relationships within the gay community, and then they will have it within the larger heterosexual community. So those diseases are freely passed. And the number one, there are two things that really cause these diseases to just flourish and to just what's the word I'm looking for, to just really take off on their own. And that is, and I'm going to get a little graphic here, the actual act, the homosexual act, in the fact that you come in contact with fecal bacteria, you come in contact with fecal matter, and that is where so many diseases are contained, are eliminated. And it is that transmission of fluid between the anus and bodily fluids that really causes the disease to proliferate. You find that 65% of all STDs arise within the homosexual community, and that's not by accident. In fact, for many years, well over 35, 40 years now, scientific literature, medical scientific literature, has recognized diseases that are strictly developed within the homosexual community. One of those is hold on, let me look for this new disease that is out. I'm not finding it right now. I wanted to bring it up, but I can't think of the name right now. But there is a new disease, and as a matter of fact, new diseases are coming across all the time within the homosexual community. Gay bowel syndrome. That's a medical term that has been around for about 40 years, and it is a known disease because of, again, the contact with the fecal matter. And also the other issue that is not brought up is the fact that the anus, the sphincter, is something that is very sensitive. It is something that is very thin and something with which you have to be very careful. So when you are putting pressure on that part of the body, it causes your sphincter to lose its elasticity and its rigidness, and you have what is called a leaky bowel syndrome. It's basically where men, and this can happen to anyone, but it's just more likely, and it occurs much more earlier, where you're unable to control your bowel movements because you have no ability to contract. You also have the risk of perforation of the anus or the intestines or any of that area. The other issue that you have is a higher rate of cancer and a higher rate of colon diseases. So all of these arise within homosexual communities. Now, Stephen says age probably results from the male body not being designed to receive seed. And that may be, from some of the studies that I've read, chart how the original AIDS cases actually began in Africa from local tribes ingesting, eating apes and monkeys and different type of unclean meats, basically bush meat. And these entered into the communities, much like Ebola. They were not really followed by the West. They weren't controlled. And it just spread from population to population. The only reason, Ebola is such a horrific and immediate crisis that it is dealt with very, very quickly. But you also look at the technology that we have today. You look at the coverage that we have, the what's the word I'm looking for? The ability to aggressively treat this, to know that these diseases exist, and to respond to them quickly. We really didn't have that 40, 50 years ago when AIDS was just coming into its own. And now you have entire African countries that are basically losing entire generations of people due to AIDS. And again, it's not they don't contract AIDS primarily as an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. They primarily contract it through eating bushmeat that is then shared with their community. Now, let me just say that AIDS is fostered and it is spread among their communities now. They're looking 2-3 generations due to a lot of their superstitious beliefs. For instance, one belief held in Tanzania and I think even Zimbabwe and a lot of these countries holds that if a man is infected with AIDS, if he will go have intercourse with a virgin, it will cure him of his AIDS. Now, we know that all that does is it affects the poor young lady, which is deemed to be the man's cure-all. So, education is really key in reversing a lot of this, but again, so is abstinence, and we're going to get into this biblical paradigm. Something else I wanted to bring up, and this is something that I have heard over the last few years, in Torah observant communities, in Christian communities, Messianic communities. I've really heard this argument across the board. And that is that Scripture only disallows male homosexuality and that female homosexuality is okay because it is not specifically addressed within Scripture. And let me just say, it is true. Scripture does not specifically address female sexuality. But does that mean that we can take it one step further and then say because it doesn't address it, that it's then okay? Well, let me submit some ideas here for you to chew on. We find that, and I'm just going to read from this because I like the ideas and what's presented here. Okay, so let me give you, these are just some examples. The law prohibits a man to sleep with both a woman and her daughter. That's Leviticus 18:17. There is no instruction in the law that explicitly prohibits a woman from sleeping with a man and his son, as long as the woman is not married to the man and his son or another man, the latter which would be classified under adultery or, and other laws, such as Leviticus 18. And the prophet Amos, however, cites as one of Israel's iniquities the situation where their father and son have slept with the same woman, regardless of whether she was married to one of them or not. And Amos says, a man and his father will go into the same maid, and this would be a young woman, to profane my holy name. So what we find in this is that the perversity is in the act that both the father and son had slept with the same woman. It was not that they were married to the same woman. Again, it comes down to the morality, the health, and the protection of the community. Because again, what happens is that when the father and the son both sleep with the same woman, it only causes the risk of sexually transmitted diseases to increase, not to mention the other psychological and emotional issues that are attached with it as well. Continuing, we find that again the perversity was in the act. Although the law does not explicitly forbid a woman to sleep with her father and his son, it does forbid a man to sleep with a woman and her daughter. That would be, again, Leviticus 18:17. Amos's castigation demonstrates that a parent-child relationship with a partner was prohibited regardless of gender. And this is really what we see throughout Torah. Many of the instructions are indeed gender neutral. You find that a lot of times God will address the man or the husband, and that the woman is not specifically mentioned. But, they are considered partners. You look at Genesis, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and they're considered one flesh. So the law considers the husband-wife relationship to be an equal partnership. So given that, it is usually assumed to address both the husband and wife, or man and woman, equally. Says the same precept would hold be true with same as homosexuality. Scripture prohibits all homosexuality regardless of gender. And let me demonstrate this with another case. Another gender-neutral law in Torah regards the Sabbath regulations. Yahweh established rest for all family members, yet the wife is not specifically mentioned. Whether you look at Exodus 20 verses 10 and 11, or Deuteronomy 5 verses 12 through 15, there is nothing in Torah that specifically grants women or wives the right to rest on Shabbat. Yahweh mentions servants, the stranger, sons and daughters, but wives are never mentioned as specifically given the right to rest on Shabbat. But they are assumed to be covered under that protection and under that liberty by the husband, because again, they are partners, they are the head of their house, and they are addressed at the same level. So again, it's a gender neutral command, but it is still, you look at the command and you look at the intent of the command, and that is where the instruction, the understanding, and the blessing is found. Same with homosexuality. Again, it's in the act and not in the gender. And you want to know why? Look again to the act and all the risks and all the diseases that it spreads. There's more and more studies coming out on female homosexuality, lesbianism, and you find that the research is showing, very similar to the male side, that there is more disease that is transmitted among women than there is among heterosexual communities, and especially not at all if they're monogamous. So again, the law we see is for protection. It eliminates risk if you follow it. And again, the other thing that YHWH tells us in Leviticus 18, he states that one of the reasons that he was driving out the Canaanites, he was driving out the Hivites, and all the nations that lived in Israel, or the land of Canaan, before Israel exited Egypt, they had all participated in homosexual rights within their communities. And it was that perversity, those diseases that were very fluent and very prevalent in their land, that was one of the reasons God was driving them out. You also find that scripture really is not alone in evidencing this, because we find that in the Armana tablets, we find that there were epidemics of disease throughout Canaan during the Judges era, within the Canaanite places and the Canaanite cities that Israel had not yet driven the people out of. So there's a lot of evidence to back up a lot of what scripture says, even outside of the scriptural context. The other thing that we find in scripture is that God is very much wants to protect women in every way. We saw last week that circumcision, although it benefits men because it reduces their risk of STDs and their risk of infection and a whole host of other diseases and potential infections, it also benefited the woman by relieving her risk of cervical cancer. This week we find it's the same. One of the things that God prohibits is for a woman to have intercourse anytime she is menstruating, whether it be her monthly cycle, whether it be after childbirth. She is to refrain from intercourse for these times. And I'd like to read to you the results of a study that was conducted by doctors Tansfer and Errol. This is the conclusions of their study, which looked at STDs among women having intercourse during a period of menstruation. They say The risk of upper tract infection in women appears to be influenced by the menstrual cycle. Evidence from clinical studies suggests that symptomatic gynecoccal or chlamydial pelvic inflammatory disease occurs most frequently during the first week of the menstrual cycle. One reason for the increased risk for infection appears to be the relative penetrability of the cervical mucus during menses. Another reason is the reflux of potential contaminated blood into the fallopian tubes during menstrual uterine contractions. For gonococcal infection, two other factors may be responsible. Iron, which is abundant in menstrual blood, may promote gonococcal growth, and the type of gonococcus that causes tubal infections may proliferate at the cervix during menstruation. The menstrual cycle also has been shown to affect phenotype changes in gonococcus that may alter gonococcal virulence. Therefore, intercourse during the menstrual period may expedite the spread of gonococci from the cervix to the endometrium and fallopian tubes. Further association with the menstrual period have been suggested for gonococcal and trichomonical infections of the lower genital tract. So in other words, there is a risk that a woman has during menses. The cervix is open. She is vulnerable. And so God protects that vulnerability, the natural housekeeping functions that her body needs to function and to reproduce. God protects her in every way. So it's not a hardship. It may be a hardship for some people, but when you look at the reasons for it, it is for the overall good and the overall health. Now, we also find that the other issues that the law addresses are premarital relations. We're told that if a couple, unlike modern society, and I would say 1920s, maybe 1950s society, where you were very much ostracized from communities if you had premarital relations. Rather, the consequence or the proper way, I don't want to say proper, that sounds old-fashioned, but the most effective and the most beneficial to society to deal with premarital relations was simply to encourage people to marry quickly if the woman became pregnant. And there were several reasons for this. One of the functions, or one of the economic realities of Israel's society, was that every man at birth inherited a piece of land. So that when you were born, males always had a piece of land from their father's estates, and women inherited dowry. This would have been vast sums of wealth. So it was very important to ensure that a man's heirs were his own. That some say if an affair had happened before the marriage, it was very important to ensure that a woman did not have an affair with another man, marry quickly a man number two, and then man number one's children inherit his estate, when maybe there's other children born later on in the marriage who are then denied their rightful right to their father's estate because another son from the affair was born first. So you really have to kind of take those factors into consideration when looking at the overall scriptural context and seeing why there were so many rules and regulations regarding relationships. The other thing that we find is that it indeed protected the morality of society. When a person was taught to refrain until they had made a commitment to someone for them to have intercourse, this really kept the society very sober. It kept the morality very stable. So what I want to look at is the inverse of this. what happens when society does not follow this instruction for morality, where most of your relationships if intercourse, where there is intercourse happens, result in marriage? What happens when when society does not embrace that value? You find that, like America today, over 1/4 of all children are born out of wedlock. And what this means is that those children are at risk. There's higher rates of birth defects, higher rates of infant mortality. But those children that do live without a father are going to have higher rates of poverty. They're going to be disadvantaged in many ways. And beyond that, they're not going to have that loving and that identity with their father that is so important in forming who they are and their character as they grow into young men and women. And let me give you some very sobering statistics. You know, I mentioned in America, over 1/3 of all children are born to out of wedlock. It's even worse actually in Europe. In Russia, and these are taken from Uberstats, which is one of the EU's reporting agencies. You know, here in the United States, we have the CDC, and we also have WHO, but that's more internationally. But in Russia and in Europe, you have the Uberstats, as well as some other government reporting agencies. So in Russia, you find that 1/3 of all children are born out of wedlock. In Sweden, 56% of the children are born out of wedlock. And in Great Britain, 42%. So what the other consequence of this is that because so many people are participating in non-committal relationships, your population naturally declines as people do not choose to commit and they don't choose to have and raise families. You also are spending your money on other things rather than raising children. So you are not replenishing your population, not taking advantage of that Abrahamic blessing where you become a multitude of people. And people, you know, there's two sides to the Abrahamic blessings. There's not just the blessings that you have of your own children, the blessings that you have of having the relationship with them, of seeing them grow and mature and all of that, spending time with them. That's one part of the foundation. The other part of it is just as important. Having a lot of children ensures your military support. It ensures your economic strength, simply because you have a lot of people to draw on that are constantly replenishing your population and constantly replenishing your social structure and contributing to the output that your country produces, whether it's to gross national product or even domestic product. All of that really comes from a very strong population. And that's something that we can see today has become very much an issue in regards to Europe and the Syrian invasion that is occurring in Europe today. They are much weaker. They do not have the population. I have mentioned this before in my interviews that both Merkel and in a GOP debate about 2 months ago, Lindsey Graham mentioned that we need Syrian refugees. We need these immigrants to come into our land because our social structures are pyramid social structures, which means that you take from the people here on the bottom to give to the people here on top. So people come into the system at age 18, 20. They start paying into Social Security. They start paying into whatever social structures, you know, pensions, all of that. They pay in when they're young. They pay in for all of these years, for, you know, maybe 20, 30 years. So these people here on top can take out. So you're supporting. And we won't mention all of the raids of these funds that have occurred all over the years that have depleted the funds. But set that aside. What has happened over the last 15, 20 years is you've started having this paradigm where you have more people taking out of the system and less people putting into the system. And because of that, um, you have a draw. You have an economic collapse that is potentially will happen in the future if you do not increase your population. Well, you can't encourage your own people to increase their population, because that would go against the feminists, that would go against all of these rights that we've embraced for the last 80 years. So you can't encourage your own people to start having more children or put programs into place. So you start encouraging immigrants to come and replace and displace your own people. I think if you read Isaiah 1, you find a lot of parallels to some of the modern situations that are occurring today. So, you know, history is repetitive, but there is a way to reverse it. And you reverse it again by embracing the Torah, embracing large families, and strengthening yourself. So let's get back. I'm going to get back to the idea of the overall structure and the overall purpose of Torah is to protect that family unit. So one of the risks that you had was for competing partners. God eliminated the risk of homosexuality, competing with partners. God also eliminated promiscuous relationships from competing with partners. So that way you had strong families based and grounded on the land that could help contribute to a very strong society. So let me catch a couple of these comments. William Forsyth says, I enjoy your program very much. I have also purchased your book, and these studies will be a great benefit to us all. Thanks. Oh, thank you so much, William. I appreciate that. I hope you do find them to be a blessing. Stephen states, so many suicidal rights. And you know, you're exactly right. That's exactly what they are. So many of the rights that we have embraced are not even rights. They're really just destruction. I don't know how many of you guys have followed the whole right to die debate in the Netherlands, and I'm trying to remember where all it took place, but there were about 5 or 6 nations that are now embracing the right to suicide, even among children. So anybody who is sad or depressed, if they can get a doctor's order and they can get all of these things, are just given this right to die. So we are literally killing ourselves with all of our supposed rights that are not rights at all. They are just simply death wishes of another kind. So it's something that we really have to, I think, educate, and something that each of us is a witness and can be a light to spark the education, to spark the debate, and hopefully to inject some sanity into the discussion. Coming back again to the idea of family rights, you do find in Torah, and there is some debate over the term mamzer, whether that refers to illegitimate children or is some undefined term that fell out of use, and something that we do not know what that term is today. That is a strong possibility. I also see a possibility that it indeed does refer to illegitimate children, simply because of the way Israel's Israel's government, the way her economy, and the way her society was structured. And that again was based on the land, arable, tribal land heritages. And when you ban someone from coming into the congregation, all that did was disallow voting rights. It did not mean they could not come to the temple to celebrate the feasts. Did not mean they could not join the community and keep a Shabbat. Remember in Numbers that every single week Israel and in her local communities is commanded to what the King James calls a holy convocation. So being excluded from Israel's Adah, this again would have been a voting assembly, did not mean that her citizens or her sons, illegitimate sons, could not participate in these community activities. The only thing it restricted were the ability to vote in legislative assemblies. Now, this would have naturally occurred simply because the only people who could vote, and we're going to see this in chapter 7, beginning the next couple weeks, the only people who could vote in Israel's legislative assemblies were actual landowners of the arable countryside. America's Constitution actually had this provision in it at the founding of the nation. It became very unpopular, and years down the road, we abandoned this very sound statute that really keeps the nations focused on the land and preserving it for future generations. So we find that God's protection, again, is for the individual family unit. So what happens then to sons, because this really did not affect daughters so much as it did sons. Daughters could always be given a dowry, so they were really protected from the Mamzer judgment. And so if the Mamzer judgment does indeed mean that sons for 10 generations are barred from Israel's congregation, what did that mean in reality? And again, loss of voting rights, but it also meant that they would have had no tribal land heritage. So they would have either A, lived in a city, had a job of some sort, earned an income as a skilled laborer. They also could have been a servant or a hired hand, or even an indentured servant like a slave for 6 years on another person's property. But those were not the only options available to him. You find that he also had the option that if his maternal grandfather were willing to give him a piece of his estate. Now, this would mean taking for his daughter's son a piece of his estate that rightfully belonged to his children. So if he was willing to do this, then that grandson would not follow under the Mamzer regulation, and he would still be eligible to vote in Israel's assemblies. But again, the concept that we have is tying Israel to the land, causing them to think of their future and the future of their heritage, their legacy upon the land for future generations. Stephen says, at the very least, the child of particular types of marriages forbidden in Torah. Yes, exactly, the Mamzer. Going on, I wanted to touch on divorce. You know, there's a lot of different thoughts over the years on what is allowed with divorce and what isn't. From the Torah's perspective, divorce is not forgiven. It is not forbidden. It's not even something that is frowned upon per se, but it is definitely, there are provisions put in place to limit divorce. So, okay, let me grab Stephen's comment real quick. It says that specifically that cutoff dealt mainly with voting membership. There's a lot of questions. Oh, great. I'm glad you find it. Yeah, you know, I really studied that for a number of years, because the traditional interpretation that cutoff meant death was something that I found very misapplied and very much out of context when you read through all the ways, all the many times that term is used. I forget what the exact Hebrew is there. I'll try to go look it up in a minute, unless you have it on hand and you can post it, Stephen. The Hebrew word that is used throughout Torah that means cut off from the congregation. So divorce was openly allowed without condemnation within Israel. Liz, I'll catch your question in just a moment. The only stipulation was that if a woman divorced, she could never remarry her first husband. A lot of the scholarly literature that I read on this pointed out that this injunction was for the woman's protection, not just from disease, that's one consideration, but more economically. It prevented a woman from remarrying and then the first husband ever taking claim to a woman's estate or anything that she had in the future. So it was really something that protected women. The other thing that you found was that the dowry, you know, this is something that I think is very much misunderstood today. Perhaps a more modern context that you may can relate to. I don't know how many of you guys have ever seen the musical Oklahoma. In one of the scenes, there is a young woman or a man that is interested in a young woman, and the father tells the man that he could marry his daughter if he was ever worth $50. So this man goes and, you know, earns his little fortune so that he can marry this guy's daughter. And that shows that he's worth it. Shows that he can be productive, and it shows that he is worth something. We find the kind of the same concept with the idea of a bride price in Israel, where a man shows that he is worth something, he can contribute, he's able to take care of a family before they just go into a relationship and really have no plans for the future. The dowry, again, men inherited land. Women inherited wealth. So this wealth was theoretically kept set aside for the woman. Should there be a death of the husband, should there be a divorce or anything else that went wrong in that marriage, it was really her insurance policy. She was welcome to take that money and invest it. In fact, we see that the woman in Proverbs 31 indeed invests a sum of wealth. But we find that that is hers, and it is their debate goes both ways in the scholarly literature as to whether or not her dowry could be forfeited if she is found guilty, say in some sort of adulterous affair, or fault is found with her along some other lines. That is debatable because Torah does not specifically address that. That is something that would have been taken up very likely within Israel's court system. So Stephen points out that the Hebrew term for cut off is karet. Thank you, Stephen. And it's very interesting. If you search that word and you look for it in every place that it's used in the Hebrew scriptures, you find that the context of the meaning of cut off does not contain this idea of death or a death penalty. In some cases it does, but not in every case. So it's a very interesting study if you guys want to follow up on that. And Stephen also says, we saw in last week's Torah portion how Laban spent his daughter's dowry rather than holding it from them. That's a very excellent point. When Jacob is out in the field and he calls Rachel and Leah to him, he says, you know, God appeared to me in a dream. He's told me to go back to the land of my fathers. And their response is basically, well, yeah, what do we have here? Because our father has squandered our dowry. You find that Laban was a very selfish man. He not only deceived his son-in-law and did not necessarily treat his daughters with justice, but he squandered away their inheritance and changed Jacob's wages several times along the way. Stephen also points out that the word karat, which means to cut off, is related to the modern term carats, which are the cuts of a diamond and are often usually referred to the weight of a diamond as far as the cuts and the weight and the quality. So that's a very interesting piece of information there. Going forward to I'm on page 211 now, and we are getting late. If you guys don't mind going over about 10 minutes, we'll finish up this chapter. You know, when you look at the consequences of not following Yahovah's morality code, you really find them to be staggering. Some of our diseases in the States and Western societies are mitigated by our access to drugs. What we're finding, second, third generation of using these treatment drugs, these disease drugs, because these are not always preventative. But in using them, you find that new strains of sexually transmitted diseases develop that are immune to the drugs that have been treating them. And as this continues, you find that there ends up in many cases it is a lifelong disease. A sexually transmitted disease is never one that goes away. You're just always treating it, and you're always living with it. And there's a very high cost to it. So you find that, let me give you share with you some of these statistics. you find that, uh, and this would have been, I'm trying to remember what year I based this off of. This might have been 2008. Based on the CDC reports in 2008. You know, some of these reports usually come out 2 to 3 years later, and I think I was working on this information back in 2010. So these rates have fluctuated. You can always go onto the CDC website and just check out where these statistics are today. But back in 2008 and 2009, and again, I see this one is in 1997, you had the CDC recorded over 300,000 cases of gonorrhea and over 8,500 new cases of syphilis. You know, these occur, and then oftentimes they're transmitted from community to community. So you can actually have people who are very sexually active, who do not really care anything about morality, but then maybe there is a person who has either a one-time sexual experience, you know, we've all heard of the bar room story, or maybe it's a person who has changed their ways or has deceived the partner. And you have a very pure, lovely person, male or female, that has a relationship, whether it's marriage or outside of a marriage, with this person that is carrying a disease and they don't even know about it. I think case in point, there was a man this week that's now facing a lawsuit. Not that he was known for his sexual purity in any way, but if you guys can think of his name, my mind is just going blank. He anyways, I'm trying to think of his name, but just Google him, you'll find him, because it just came out that he has HIV, and he has infected people for the last something like 7 or 8 years and didn't bother to tell anyone. So these are the risks that you come across when your society does not take monogamy as a concept and a value to heart. You also find that that STDs claim the lives of over 40 million people a year. That's a pretty staggering statistic. Now that is worldwide. And again, these statistics hold true whether you're Christian, whether you are Jewish, whether you are Buddhist, whether you are atheist. It really doesn't matter what you believe. You know, kind of reality is reality, no matter where your faith lies, simply because actions do speak louder than words, and sometimes those actions are what define the character of your society, as well as the emotional health. There was one year, it was back in, I'm looking at this, I believe it was 1991, where Tanzania had, or no, Tanzania had over 1 million children in a generation. This is just one, yeah, Charlie Sheen. Thank you very much. That's who it was. So in one generation, you have over 1 million children that are orphans because their parents have died of HIV. That is staggering. Yes, in the United States, we have drugs to treat it. They are actually getting those drugs in Zimbabwe and in these African countries. But the disease, it has spread so prolifically that it's difficult to contain. And has not spread like that here in the United States, simply because at the initial outbreak that was responded to very quickly, and it is usually treated. But Charlie Sheen, case in point, he has infected how many, you know, perhaps hundreds of people that they were not even aware, and now they will have to find out if they are indeed infected today. So on page 212, I do have a chart, and this shows the potential contact of one man, which is about 40 people, so that if you have relations with one person who has had relations with one person previously before, just those two people can represent a sexual contact with over 40 people. So that is just astounding when you think of the risk of disease that you open yourself up to, and that society allows with this type of lifestyle and this very openly accepting of any sexual relationship. The other and the last part that I find very heartbreaking is that there is the reality of inheritance. So that, you know, Liz, I am going to come back and get your question. I haven't forgotten about you. In Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, we are told that oftentimes the sins of the fathers pass to the children, to the third and fourth generation. Now, with sexually transmitted diseases, this is a reality. Every year, children are born with sexually transmitted diseases that prevent them from ever maturing into adolescence or adulthood. They die before that ever occurs. Some are born blind. Some are born with physical disabilities, not because they did anything wrong. They were purely innocent in this, but their fathers and mothers made poor choices, and it is affecting them. So that is simply a reality of the way inheritance works. And the only way to reverse that is to stop doing the act, to stop the disease in its tracks by returning to a moral-based code within society whereby your people, the things that you do, foster the rights of the family above all else and protect and preserve those rights. And ultimately, it really protects your personal dignity, your personal self-worth, because you value yourself so much that you are going to invest the best in your society and the best in your nation and your community. So this is something that really benefits an entire nation, and taken exponentially can benefit the world. But it does require self-control. It requires exercising choice, making difficult decisions at times, and choosing something that I would say is perhaps a more philosophical way of life rather than, I guess, what you would call a primal way of living. But what we find when we look at the overall paradigm of relationships in Torah, whether we look at the food God gives us to eat, whether we look at circumcision, or rather the food that he prohibits us from eating, circumcision, family relations, every single one of these helps preserve and protect the integrity of society. So that when we read Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, where YHWH states, "Behold, I have given you statutes and judgments this day, that if you follow them, you will become the wisest, most strongest, and most understanding people, that all nations will say, what nation on earth is there that is so righteous and that has these statutes and judgments, and that has God so close to them?" If we want to be close to God, it's right here. The ability to do that is here. But it's not done with platitudes. It's not done by wishful thinking or vain beliefs. It's done by doing. Sometimes your doing is simply refraining. But it is done by doing that invests a better future, not just for you and your family, but for the larger community. So now coming back to Liz's comments, she asks, was Jesus considered a mamzer? Genetically, I would say probably yes. If you look at the rules of inheritance, the claim is made that there is a seed of David. Well, the only way you can have that seed of David is if it comes through the father. On Mary's side, you find that there's a Levitical side on Mary's side. Now, also keep in mind, at the time of the Second Temple period, Israel did not, and I won't say Israel, let me say Judea, because that is technically the name that Israel, that we use to designate that time period. But Judea did not necessarily have the tribal land heritages that they did during the First Temple period. So you really didn't have some of this tribal succession, or you may have, we're just not as aware of it because not much is written of it during that time period. So that what tribal land heritage did Jesus have that he would have been tied to? You know, was he given part of Joseph's estate? If he was given part of Joseph's estate, then he may not have been considered a mamzer. So that does leave open that possibility, but it definitely raises questions regard to genealogical claims that have been made. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it is definitely a very interesting discussion to have. So at this point, I'm going to open it to open discussions. Any comments or thoughts that you've had, or something else you've read or studied this week, feel free to post. We'll keep the room open about 5 to 10 more minutes. And I've enjoyed, again, spending time with you guys. I enjoy sharing this information and talking with you guys about it. I just find that returning to Torah has such potential to bring unity to our land, to strengthen us in every way. And, you know, there's so many ancient promises that we are on the threshold of fulfilling. And, you know, it's just a matter of claiming it and doing it. So we are right there. So any other comments or questions, please don't be shy. So, and just in case some of you guys have been wondering and asking, there are some people that have actually made it through chapter 19 and hit that page, what is it, 811, the last page of the book. And I have started working on volume 2 that is underway. And it's going to be something that will definitely be a game changer. I'm not going to give away too much, but it is definitely something that if you've ever had questions or things just haven't quite matched up in your theological perspective, it will definitely give you something, I think, that you can hold on to and be a blessing. So, okay. Well, thank you guys for all of your comments and your participation. Thank you for remembering the names. I am not very good with names. That is my nemesis, is trying to remember names. So thank you for posting Charlie Sheen there. And you guys have a fantastic weekend. I would like to invite everyone to join us tomorrow morning at 10:30 Central, back here on YouTube, but at a different address. It will be Roots of Faith. Join us there, and we have a chat room open there, and it will be a lot of fun. And Liz, I'm sorry, I just remembered. I always forget when I see your name that it's really Betty. So I'm glad you made it, Betty. And great to see all you guys here. So I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow, and have a fantastic evening. I'm going to go ahead and close the room down and look forward to fellowshipping with y'all tomorrow morning. Shabbat Shalom.